In the 4th century CE, in a panegyric by Claudius Mamertinus to the Roman Emperor Julian, Julian is praised for, among other things, defending astronomy. He says that the Christian ire for astronomy was so great that who would dare to watch the rising of the star, who the setting? Not even the farmer, whose works were to be controlled by the movement of the heavenly signs, and by whom predictions of the weather were sought. The sailors themselves, who rely on the course of the stars at night, abstained from the names of the stars. Claims that Christianity was the driving force behind a centuries to millennia-long suppression of scientific progress are commonplace. However, others claim that the Church was supportive of astronomy. Some go so far as to claim that a belief in God is required for science, or that the Church's attempt to quash heresy and superstition led to the development of science as a discipline, and thus science owes a debt to Christianity. But in my research, I found both of these views to be overly simplified. Those that claim that the Church suppressed science fail to explain how, if that were true, we find so many prominent figures in the Church engaging in astronomy. Meanwhile, those that say the Church did nothing wrong ignore the criticisms and condemnations. So, in this video, we'll hear from saints and popes to learn how Christians really viewed astronomy before the telescope. Before diving in, we should take a few minutes to define some terms. I'll begin with astronomy. In my previous video on a brief history of astronomy before the telescope, I concluded by noting that astronomy as practiced in this era was far more expansive than we generally consider astronomy today. I often discuss this in the terms of the Four Astronomies. The first is practical astronomy, using the patterns of the night sky for telling time, setting calendars, and navigation. The second is philosophical or cosmological astronomy, asking the big questions about the nature of the cosmos and attempting to use philosophy to answer them. The third is mathematical astronomy, attempting to build predictive models of the cosmos. And the last is astrology, assigning meaning to the motions of the heavens. So, if we're to examine the opinions of Christians on astronomy, we need to consider astronomy in all of these forms. While Christianity is rooted in the Bible, that text contains very little commentary on astronomy. Thus, we'll need to get an idea of how astronomy was viewed by its adherents, as well as official positions by the governing body, the Church. However, even this is complicated, as Christianity is littered with schisms, averaging a couple per century. Most of the branches died off relatively quickly, so we'll stick to the most major branch, the Catholic Church, although it underwent its own schisms in 1054, splitting into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, as well as the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. As far as individuals within the Church, those that I'll be citing are largely individuals who are closely associated with the Church as clergy. Additionally, we'll look at individuals whose writings are considered especially influential. Such individuals are recognized as doctors of the Church. However, we'd still be at risk of instances in which, as a hypothetical, a bishop goes rogue and starts going on about astronomy in a way that's not generally in line with the more widely accepted position. To combat that, I'll focus on comments which are reinforced by others or have resonance with a larger principle. To start, let's go through some of the most important figures to give you an idea of who we're talking about and when they were active. This way, I don't need to stop to introduce new figures, and you'll have a handy spot in the video to return to if you forget who someone was. First, going chronologically, We have Tertullian, who lived in the 2nd to 3rd century. He lived in Carthage and was the first Christian author to write in Latin and is thus considered the father of Latin Christianity. Next, we have Lactantius, who lived in the 3rd and 4th century. He was an advisor to the Roman Emperor Constantine I, the Roman emperor that made Christianity the official religion of Rome. We also have Dionysius of Alexandria. He was a pope from the 3rd century and would later be sainted. Similarly, we have Basil of Caesarea from the 4th century. He was the bishop of Caesarea in modern-day Turkey and is considered one of the Cappadocian Fathers as well as one of the 3 holy hierarchs. He also was later sainted and is considered a doctor of the Church. We have Gregory of Nazianzus from the 4th century. He was the Archbishop of Constantinople in Turkey, the 2nd of the Cappadocian Fathers as well as the 3 holy hierarchs, and he too was later sainted. Next is Gregory of Nyssa, also from the 4th century, Bishop of Nyssa, again in Turkey, and the 3rd of the Cappadocian Fathers, and also sainted. We also have John Chrysostom, also from the 4th century, and the Archbishop of Constantinople. He was the last of the 3 holy hierarchs, also a doctor of the Church, and a Greek father of the Church. He too was later sainted. Next is Ambrose of Milan, also the Bishop of Milan in Italy, the doctor of the Church, and a 4th century saint. We also have Cyril of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Jerusalem in Israel, and a doctor of the Church from the 4th century. He too was sainted. We also have Athanasius of Alexandria. He lived in the 4th century in modern-day Egypt and was also a doctor of the Church. He's recognized for first defining the 27 books of the New Testament in use today and is considered one of the Greek fathers of the Church. He too was sainted. Next is Augustine of Hippo, better known as Saint Augustine, and he lived in the 4th and 5th century. He was the bishop of Hippo Regius in Numidia in northeast Algeria. Also, he was a doctor of the Church and helped formulate the doctrine of original sin. Next is Jerome of Stridon. He was a priest and translated the Bible into Latin, known as the Vulgate Bible. He too is a doctor of the Church, lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, and is also a saint. We also have Gregory the Great. He was a pope in the 6th century and is considered a father of the Church and a doctor of the Church. He was also later sainted. Next is Gregory of Tours. He was the Bishop of Tours in modern-day France in the 6th century and also was sainted. Next is Martin of Braga, who was the Archbishop of Bracara Augusta in modern-day Portugal in the 6th century and was also a saint. Next, Isidore of Seville in the 7th century. He was the Archbishop of Seville in Spain, is a doctor of the Church, and was also sainted. From the 8th century, we have Alcuin of York, who was the Abbot of Marmoutier in France. In the 10th century comes Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II. Next is Johann de Sacrobosco, who was a monk from the 12th century. Later that century, and going into the 13th, was Michael Scott, who was a priest. Next is Pope John the 21st from the 13th century. From that same century, we have Thomas Aquinas, who was a friar and priest in modern-day Sicily and a doctor of the Church. He was later sainted as well. Next is Robert Grosseteste from the 13th century, who was the Bishop of Lincoln. We also have Albertus Magnus, who was a 13th century friar and bishop in modern-day Germany and is a doctor of the Church, who would later be sainted. Next is Pope Gregory XIII from the 16th century. We'll also hear from Pope Sixtus V from the 16th century as well. With that out of the way, the first thing we need to understand is that many of these writers were quite interested in astronomy. Frequently, they were trained in classical philosophy and rhetoric. Isidore of Seville is an excellent example of this. Two of his works, Etymologies and De Natura Rerum, both contain primers on astronomy, explaining many of the fundamental concepts, such as the celestial spheres and the cycles of the moon. As an example, here's his explanation of the poles of the heavens. The poles of the heavens are the extreme parts of the axis. They are called poles because the heavens are turned on them, or because these poles are turned as if they were the heart. This is a perfectly cogent explanation that would have been entirely at home in any of the Greek astronomical texts. Thus, we can immediately see that any claims that Christianity was fully against astronomy are false. Many of these Christians that we'll discuss were astronomers, at least to some extent. Their texts may not have captured the full depth of the field, but we find the most important basic ideas being transmitted and discussed by these authors, often without any sort of criticism. Additionally, nowhere do we find an attempt to formulate a fully Christian cosmology to replace the Greek astronomy. Christians simply attempt to fit the Greek cosmos into their theology, with more or less friction depending on the specific topic. But before diving into specific criticisms, I want to take a moment to attempt to categorize the types of objections that we'll be seeing. Given that many of these authors were astronomers, it should be no surprise that they engaged in astronomy on its own terms. In other words, we find these authors participating in the discussions of natural philosophy in an entirely secular manner. In particular, some of the arguments we'll see with respect to astrology are entirely based on logic and are still devastating critiques today without ever invoking Christianity. That being said, there are certainly reasons which portions of astronomical thought would draw attacks on entirely theological grounds. Specifically, there are a few particularly thorny phrases in the Bible that conflicted with the Greek cosmos. The most commonly debated one comes from Genesis 1, verses 6 and 7, which states, "And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so." Taken literally, these state that there is a body of water above the sky. Thus, we find many of these Christian writers adding another sphere to the cosmos outside the Greek sphere of stars. From there, we see further debate on the nature of this sphere. In doing so, they attempt to find an understanding of the theologically presumed sphere using natural philosophy. We find some of this discussion in the text De Mundi Caelestis Terrestri Constitutione Liber. The work is often incorrectly attributed to the Venerable Bede, but its true author is unknown. However, it is still believed to have been written in a monastic environment. Regardless of the authorship, the writer describes several competing thoughts on this sphere of water. It states that some writers think that the water is in the form of clouds due to the heat of heaven. Others, such as Basil of Caesarea, treat the placement a bit more liberally and interpret the water as clouds, which he claims cool the earth from the sun, and when it becomes depleted, will cause the earth to end in fire in accordance with prophecy. Others write that it is frozen due to its great distance from the sun. Still others think that it is liquid, but held there due to the power of God in order to cool heaven. In all cases mentioned, we see authors accepting the theological supposition of this sphere of water, but discussing it in the context of natural philosophy. But in other cases, the theology was absolute and would conflict outright with certain astronomical ideas. This primarily came when astronomical propositions might challenge the omnipotence or majesty of God. Basil of Caesarea speaks out against such propositions in his Hexameron, stating, "Of what use then are geometry, the calculations of arithmetic, the study of solids, and far-famed astronomy, this laborious vanity, if those who pursue them imagine that this visible world is co-eternal with the Creator of all things, with God himself? If they attribute to this limited world, which has a material body, the same glory as to the incomprehensible and invisible nature, if they cannot conceive that a whole, of which the parts are subject to corruption and change, must of necessity end by itself submitting to the fate of its parts?" In short, Basil warns the reader not to put the creation on par with the Creator. His reasoning is that if one does so, then just as the world is subject to change and degradation, then so too is God. This proposition then falls foul of the principle that God is eternal. Furthermore, God's power could also be rejected by asserting that humanity did not have free will, and nowhere was this more evident than in astrology, which crashed headlong into Christian reasoning, as we'll see later in this video. Lastly, even if there wasn't an outright theological objection, we find authors expressing concern with astronomy based on reasons of spirituality. In particular, Christian writers of this era had a concept of dangerous or illegitimate knowledge, known as curiositas. This is quite similar to the concept of gluttony, in which food is necessary to survive, but too much is ruinous. They hold the same as true for knowledge, and Christian scholars outline some reasons that knowledge could be harmful. The first is that it could simply distract from a spiritual or godly focus. For example, Lactantius emphasized the purpose of inquiry into the natural world should be spiritual contemplation, stating, "God willed that we should look up into heaven, and undoubtedly not without reason. For both the birds and almost all of dumb creation see the heaven, but it is given to us in a peculiar manner to behold the heaven as we stand erect, that we may seek religion there, that since we cannot see God with our eyes, we may, with our mind, contemplate him, whose throne is there." Later in this text, he would write, "Therefore we are not born for this purpose, that we may see those things which are created, but that we may contemplate, that is, behold with our mind, the Creator of all things himself." Here we can see Lactantius suggesting that the purpose of astronomy should be to know God, not to know the creation. If we are to gaze upwards, we should ignore the heavens itself and use it only to marvel at God's power. Other early Christian writers agree with this. Basil of Caesarea, in his Hexameron, spends some time musing about Greek astronomy, but ultimately suggests not to look to observation and reason for answers, but simply to default to Scripture, stating, "Let us reply to those who ask us upon what support this enormous mass rests. In his hands are the ends of the earth. It is a doctrine as infallible for our own information as profitable for our hearers." A similar sentiment was expressed by St. Ambrose, who stated, "Since it is not profitable to be concerned with astronomical knowledge, let us rather turn our attention to those matters which may be fruitful for eternal life." At his funeral, Gregory of Nazianzus affirmed Basil's position, stating, "Basil despised excessive application of astronomy, geometry, and numerical proportion, as useless to those whose desire is godliness." Athanasius of Alexandria states similar, criticizing mankind for ignoring God and getting lost in idolatry. "Yet man, despising this, fell into idolatry, leaving the unseen God for magic and astrology, and all this in spite of God's manifold revelation of himself." In short, these authors suggest that the astronomical pursuits should not be the focus of a Christian, as that knowledge simply wasn't important for salvation. Cyril of Jerusalem emphasizes this, writing, "And a man sitting in his ship and sailing amid the boundless waters steers his ship by looking at the stars. For of these matters the Scripture approves, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for years, not for fables of astrology and narratives. In short, let the stars be stars." Pope Gregory the Great echoes this, stating, "Man was not made for the sake of the stars, but the stars were made for the sake of man." A second reason that knowledge may be dangerous is that it could induce one of the deadly sins, pride. St. Ambrose suggested that the measurement of the earth and the heavens was an expression of scientific conceit, stating, Who then ventures to put his knowledge on the same plane with God? Does man presume to offer in the way of knowledge what God has sealed with his own oracular and majestic pronouncements? St. Augustine explicitly ties this to astronomical pursuits in the 5th book of his Confessions, stating, "By the proud you, God, are not found, not even if their curiosity and skill number the stars and the sand, measure the constellations, and trace the path of the stars." Augustine also reminds us of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, which tells us, "Knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies." Astronomy is not prohibited, but it is fraught with danger. Among the earliest interactions we find between Christianity and astronomy is criticisms of astro-pagan religions and astronomy too closely associated with pagan ideas. The Bible warns against making idols of the stars. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19, it states, "And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all the nations under heaven." Thus, sects placing what Christians considered undue significance on the sky would become subject to attack. A potential challenger to early Christianity was Manichaeism. This religion arose in modern-day Iran in the 3rd century and was a blend of Platonism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and several other religions and mystery cults. Around 400 CE, one of its adherents, named Faustus of Mileve, wrote a criticism of Christianity, to which St. Augustine responded at length in a work titled Contra Faustus. In Book 20 of his response, Augustine quotes Faustus at some length, giving us a glimpse into the traditions of this religion. In it, we see that Manichaeans do homage to the divine luminaries as manifestations of a distinctly Christian trinity. He states that the Father properly dwells in the highest or principal light, and the Son, Jesus, is himself twofold, and that his power dwells in the sun and his wisdom lay in the moon. Lastly, they believe that the Holy Spirit has his seat and his home in the whole circle of the atmosphere. Augustine criticizes Manichaeism on these astronomical grounds. Specifically, the Manichaeans believed that the sun, carrying Jesus' power, was shaped as a ship viewed through a triangular hole in the heavens. However, since the sun is observably round, this makes the claim absurd on its face, and thus Augustine tells the reader the Manichaeans worship familiar luminaries, not for what they are, but for what your wild fancy makes them to be. For this, he condemns them as far worse than pagans. As pagans, he tells us, at least worship something real, even if they do so incorrectly. In my video on a brief history of astronomy before the telescope, I quickly discussed a resurgence in astronomical interest during the Carolingian Renaissance. This included a surge of interest in the history, mythology, and layout of the constellations. Several texts were compiled in this vein. However, constellation mythology had its detractors within the Church. We see such criticisms from Gregory of Nazianzus in his Contra Faustus, which is a polemic against the Roman Emperor Julius, who was no supporter of Christianity. To him, Gregory says, "Thou dost compose incredible stories and gapest up at the skies, telling lies about celestial matters. Tell me of those stars of thine, of Ariadne's crown, of Berenice's hair, the lascivious swan, the violent bull, or, if thou please, tell me of thine Ophiuchus, or of thy Capricorn, or of thy lion, or all the rest that thou hast discovered for a bad end, and made them into gods in constellations." Here, Gregory is including the various constellation myth as lies about celestial matters. In a commentary on the prophet Amos, who mentions the star Arcturus and the constellation of Orion, St. Jerome writes that, "We must not follow the fables of the poets and the ridiculous and portentous lies with which they try to slander even heaven." Isidore of Seville is somewhat less severe in De Natura Rerum. There, he warns his readers that the use of pagan names of constellations does not imply acceptance of the immoral stories behind them. He writes, "While we read in sacred scripture these names of the stars, we do not give credence to the empty deliriums of the poets who, with false opinions, tell of the stars being named after men or from the names of other creatures. For wise men choose the names of stars, just as they did the names of the days, and if the sacred scriptures make use of these same names, nevertheless, it does not approve the false tales about them, but makes the figures of invisible things from visible things, and places names on them which are widely known, for the benefit of man." Gregory of Tours' De Cursus Stellarum Ratione is a handbook for monks on monastic timekeeping using the sky. However, he refuses to use the names of stars and constellations from Virgil and others in antiquity because he did not teach astrology and did not mean to investigate the future. Thus, he uses new names for the constellations that are so obscure, it is often difficult to determine which he's even referring to. One unknown Christian author went so far as to try to reinterpret zodiac constellations using Christian symbology in De Astronomia More Christiano. However, trying to remove or rebrand the constellations ultimately proved fruitless, as even the Bible contains references to them, such as in Job 38:31-32 and in Job 9, verse 9. Another surprising target of Christian ire was the Milky Way. Isidore of Seville mentions it briefly in his Etymologies, describing it only as a white circle across the sky. He states that some people, incorrectly, describe it as the road where the sun makes its circuit, and that it shines from the splendor of the sun's transit. However, the Milky Way carried more significance theologically than a simple band of light across the sky. Sources such as Martinus Capella's Marriage of Philology and Mercury, as well as Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio, upheld the Platonic notion that the Milky Way was the home of virtuous souls, a view supported by many ancient philosophers, including Macrobius, Porphyry, Numenius, Manilius, Ovid, Cicero, and Heraclides of Pontus. That virtuous souls did not go to heaven would have obviously not been consistent with Christian theology, leaving Christian writers to try to figure out how best to deal with these claims. In the 13th century, we have Michael Scott. To address the issue, he attempted to rename the Milky Way, calling it the Demon Meridianus, in an effort to stigmatize it. In that same century, the monk and astronomer Johann de Sacrobosco wrote one of the most popular astronomical texts of the remainder of the medieval period, De Sphera. He simply pretended that the Milky Way didn't exist. However, the official position of the Church was adopted from St. Thomas Aquinas, who had taken a page from Aristotle. Aristotle had proposed that the Milky Way wasn't a celestial phenomenon at all. Rather, he suggested it was caused by the Earth's own atmosphere. Moving the position of the Milky Way to the terrestrial sphere had the effect of rendering it unable to be associated with divine matters such as souls. An even more surprising source of astronomical tension with some Christians was the days of the week. Isidore of Seville describes their origins in De Natura Rerum. Among the Romans, the days of the week took their names from the planets, that is, from the wandering stars. We say that the first day is named for the sun because it is the first of all stars, and so this day is the head of other days. The second is named from the moon, which is near the sun both in splendor and in magnitude, and thence changes its light. The third is named for the star Mars, which is called Vespers. The fourth is named for the star Mercury, which they call the White Circle. The fifth from the star Jupiter, which they call Phaethon. The sixth from the star Venus, which they call Lucifer, and has more light than all of the other stars. The seventh from the star Saturn, which, being located in the seventh sphere of heaven, requires 30 years to complete its course. Here, we can clearly see the connection between the names of the days of the week and the planets, which are, in turn, based on the Greek gods. This drew the ire of Martin of Braga, who, in De Correctione Resticorum, tells of peasants who give the names of these demons to each day of the week, calling these days by the names of Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, where they created no days, but were wicked and evil men amongst the Greeks. What folly it therefore is that man, baptized in the faith of Christ, does not honor the Lord's day, but says to honor the days of Jupiter and Mercury and Venus and Saturn, who have no days of their own, but rather were adulterers and sorcerers, and were wicked, and who died evilly in their own land. To that end, Martin persuaded the locals to abandon the conventional names for the days of the week. Instead, they were replaced by a more literal first day, second day, etc. The language was a precursor to modern Portuguese, and is why the language retains this peculiarity to this day. Not all astronomy had overtly pagan influences which were objectionable. The first form of astronomy that I discussed is that of practical astronomy. This field was generally well supported by the Church. Support for this kind of astronomy is found right at the outset of Genesis, which states, "God said, let there be luminaries in the vault of the sky, to divide the spheres of day and night. Let them give portents, and be the measures of time, to mark out the day and the year." Basil of Caesarea echoes this in his Hexameron and elaborates on the calendar. "How does the sun rule by day? Because carrying everywhere light with it, it is no sooner risen above the horizon than it drives away the darkness and brings us day. Thus we might, without self-deception, define day as air lighted by the sun, or as the space of time that the sun passes in our hemisphere. The functions of the sun and moon serve, further, to mark the years. The moon, after having 12 times run her course, forms a year which sometimes needs an intercalary month to make it exactly agree with the seasons. Such was formerly the year of the Hebrews and of the early Greeks. As to the solar year, it is the time that the sun, having started from a certain sign, takes to return in its normal progress." Isidore of Seville's Etymologies also begins with a section on astronomy, with a discourse on timekeeping. Thus, there was never any objection to astronomy for this purpose. Indeed, Christian astronomers worked to develop and spread this knowledge. However, there was certainly one driving interest behind this for Christians: the date for Easter. Christian tradition originally based the date to celebrate Easter on the Jewish calendar, placing it on the first Sunday following 14 Nisan. However, since the Jewish calendar is based on lunar cycles, this sometimes placed this date before the spring equinox and sometimes after. This angered many early Christians, such as Dionysius of Alexandria, who stated, "At no time other than the spring equinox is it legitimate to celebrate Easter." Similarly, Anatolius of Alexandria declared it a great mistake to set the Paschal lunar month when the sun is in the 12th sign of the zodiac, i.e. before the equinox. And it was explicitly stated by Peter, the Bishop of Alexandria, that men of the present day now celebrate Passover before the spring equinox, through negligence and error. Clearly, the desire to calculate this important date independently was also driven by anti-Semitism, as an author in 243 explicitly states in a book on calculating the date of Easter that Christians were tired of listening to the blind and stupid Jews on this matter. Reviews of manuscripts from monastery schools show that calculating the date of Easter was among the most common math problems given. The tables necessary to do so were frequently copied, and over 1,200 of them, dating between the 8th and the 11th century, still exist today. However, Easter aside, there was a more fundamental problem. That problem was the Julian calendar. This calendar system assumed that the length of the year was exactly 365.25 days. This is quite close to the true value of 365.2422 days, but given enough time, the calendar drifts, and by the 16th century, the date of the vernal equinox no longer fell on the proper date. Thus, in 1545, the Council of Trent authorized Pope Paul III to reform the calendar, such that the date of the vernal equinox would be restored to the date that it had during the First Council of Nicaea in 325. They also required that the calendar not drift in the future. This was a huge astronomical task, as the length of the year was not fully settled at the time. Specifically, the council needed to determine how much longer a year was than 365 days. The ancient sources did not have a consensus. Eventually, the council turned to more recent sources, which agreed that a year was 0.2425 days longer than 365 days. A system of leap days was eventually devised to ensure that the average length of the year matched this new value, and on September 29, 1582, the new calendar was made official by a papal bull issued by Pope Gregory XIII, for whom our calendar system is now named. Overall, Christians did not have any serious aversion to pagan knowledge when it came to setting practical astronomy. However, we do begin seeing some friction when it comes to philosophical or cosmological astronomy. But even on those topics, Christians were somewhat reserved in rejecting Greek knowledge. St. Augustine warned fellow Christians that it would be disgraceful and dangerous for Christians to be heard talking nonsense on things like the shape of the earth, which had been known to be round for centuries. This may have been in response to writers such as Lactantius, who argued in favor of a flat earth. In Institutiones Divinae, he mocks the idea without giving it much in the way of justification. The only argument presented is that it is impossible for the heavens to be lower than the earth. Other authors, such as Isidore of Seville and the Venerable Bede, both describe the world as egg-shaped. But where philosophical astronomy really came into conflict with the Church was during the 13th century. Near the beginning of this century, texts by Aristotle and Plato made their way into Christian Europe. They became extremely popular as a topic of discussion and debate amongst the students at the University of Paris, and many of the questions they discussed had theological implications. This includes questions like whether the cosmos had a beginning or an end. Obviously, Christian theology has answers to these questions, and they were concerned that the Greek text described the universe as eternal. Pope John XXI ordered an investigation into these works, which led to a series of condemnations between 1210 and 1277. In the first of these, from 1210, Aristotle's natural philosophy was banned for students of the arts on penalty of excommunication for anyone teaching these texts. Eventually, enforcement of this waned, and by 1240, Roger Bacon was lecturing on Aristotle's physics. By 1255, study of these texts was required. However, another condemnation came in 1270, in which, instead of banning entire texts, banned only specific propositions, which could impinge on religious sovereignty. This included the aforementioned questions on whether the world was eternal. The final set was passed down in 1277, and included a list of 219 propositions which could not be considered as potential answers that were contrary to the Church's teachings. Many of these propositions were entirely theological in nature and did not touch on astronomy at all. However, others did. For example, Proposition 76 banned the concept that the intelligence moving the heaven influences the rational soul just as the body of heaven influences the human body. Due to the necessity of practical astronomy, it should be unsurprising that we find sophistication with respect to solar and lunar astronomy quite early. During the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne learned to predict eclipses from his tutor, Alcuin of York, the abbot of Marmoutier. Following Alcuin's death, Charlemagne also discussed the topic with the Irish monk Drugel in 811. On December 22, 968, the Bishop of Liege was called upon to explain a total solar eclipse to terrified troops, and correctly explained that they were caused by the passing of the moon in front of the sun. However, it seems that this knowledge was not particularly widespread. In 612, Isidore of Seville provided a draft of his work De Natura Rerum to his patron, Sigebert, the king of the Visigoths. The king provided Isidore with an explanation of the causes of eclipses, as Isidore was evidently unaware of them. In the 11th century, the monk Ralph the Bald showed a lack of understanding regarding eclipses, explaining, God placed some wondrous thing between the sun and the moon, or the sphere of some other star intruded into that position. What really happened is known only to the Creator. But, in contrast to solar and lunar astronomy, Charlemagne and his advisors were clearly not well versed with planetary astronomy. In July of 798, Charlemagne wrote to Alcuin, surprised that Mars was suddenly visible again, when its motion should have taken it out of the night sky. Alcuin qualitatively attributed this to retrograde motion, but that this had not been predicted quantitatively indicates an unfamiliarity with the methods by which to do so. In addition, in 807, Charlemagne believed he observed the transit of Mercury across the face of the sun. However, he reported that it lasted for 8 days, whereas a transit by Mercury would take mere hours, indicating that this was a large sunspot as opposed to Mercury, a fact that Charlemagne did not understand. This dichotomy, in which solar and lunar astronomy are well practiced, but planetary astronomy is clearly neglected, raises an interesting question. Why one, but not the other? One possibility is that there was a pressing need for the former as it had the practical applications previously discussed, whereas planetary astronomy serves no practical purpose, unless, that is, you include astrology as a purpose, and that opens its own can of worms. The Christian take on astrology is generally somewhat nuanced, although not in all cases. An example is Tertullian, who condemns astrology outright, writing, "We observe among the arts also some professions liable to the charge of idolatry. Of astrologers there should be no speaking even. But since one in these days has challenged us, defending on his own behalf perseverance in that profession, I will use a few words. I allege not that he honors idols, whose names he has inscribed on the heaven, to whom he has attributed all God's power. One proposition I lay down, that those angels, the deserters of God, were likewise the discoverers of this curious art, on that account also condemned by God." This is echoed by Cyril of Jerusalem, who stated, "Give heed neither to astrological predictions, nor bird signs, nor omens, nor to the fabulous divinations of the Greeks." In the 4th century, we see the early Christian emperors outlawing the practice of astrology entirely. A law from 409, known as De Maleficis et Mathematicus etc. Similibus, threatens astrologers with torture if they do not give up their text to be burned before the eyes of the bishops. Condemnation of astrology even exists in the Bible. Isaiah 47 verses 13 and 14 states, "Let your astrologers come forward, those stargazers who make predictions month by month. Let them save you from what is coming upon you. Surely they are like stubble. The fire will burn them up. They cannot save themselves from the power of the flame. These are not coals for warmth. This is not a fire to sit by." In contrast, Genesis 1 verse 14 tells readers that the heavens can be looked to for signs. However, Christian scholars debate what these signs may be. The most basic is what is referred to as the labors of the month, which described an annual cycle of activities that should be performed in specific months. In many ways, this overlaps with calendrical astronomy. However, it is given a decidedly astrological overtone as one of the most common sources for these labors, books of hours, frequently depicted the labors with astrological imagery, specifically the zodiological signs associated with each month. By and large, Christian writers accept using the sky to know when to perform certain actions. However, Martin of Braga warned about taking this too far and condemned observing the moon or stars to determine when to build a house, plant trees, or consort with one's wife. The association of the heavens with the cycles of nature was fairly well understood and accepted. Basil of Caesarea even accepts that the moon is responsible for the tides, saying, "The waters of straits approach and retreat from one shore to the other during the different phases of the moon. But, when she is new, they have not an instant of rest, and move in perpetual swaying to and fro, until the moon, reappearing, regulates their reflux. As to the western sea, we see it in its ebb and flow, now return to its bed, and now overflow, as the moon draws it back by her respiration, and then, by her expiration, urges it to its own boundaries." But how far could these influences extend? Another thing that Basil believed the moon could predict was the weather. He goes so far as to give an example, stating, "Towards the third day of the new moon, if it is sharp and clear, it is a sign of fixed fine weather. If its horns appear thick and reddish, it threatens us either with heavy rain or with a gale from the south." He also states that the moon has an influence on animals. "I believe also that the variations of the moon do not take place without exerting great influence upon the organization of the animals and of all living things." Lastly, Basil reminds us that the Bible also tells us that the coming dissolution of the universe, i.e. Judgment Day, will be signaled with various astrological omens. According to Luke 21, verse 25, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. According to Joel 2, verse 31, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. In Revelation 6, verse 12, it says, "The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon turned to blood red." Revelation 8, verse 12 says, "The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night." So clearly, these Christian writers accepted that the heavens could have an influence on the world and be interrogated for omens. But Basil cautions readers not to overstep the borders, as those who read too much into astrology will only see the will of their imagination, ultimately describing astrology as a vain science. Isidore of Seville describes the difference between astronomy and astrology, stating, "There is some difference between astronomy and astrology. Astronomy concerns itself with the turning of the heavens, the rising, setting, and motion of the stars, and where the constellations get their names. But astrology is partly natural and partly superstitious. It is natural as long as it investigates the courses of the sun and moon, or the specific positions of the stars according to the seasons, but it is superstitious belief that the astrologers follow when they practice augury by the stars, or when they associate the 12 signs of the zodiac with specific parts of the soul or body, or when they attempt to predict the nativities and characters of people by the motion of the stars." In another of his works, De Natura Rerum, he lists the astrological influences of the planets, but then tells readers that people who imagine such ridiculous things are foolish. Many of these arguments are repeated by St. Augustine in the century following Basil. In his work De Civitate Dei, Augustine again acknowledges the influences of the heavens in some respects. "It is not altogether absurd to say that certain sidereal influences have some power to cause differences in bodies alone, as, for instance, we see that the seasons of the year come round by approaching and the receding of the sun, and that certain kinds of things are increased in size or diminished by the waxings and wanings of the moon, such as sea urchins, oysters, and the wonderful tides of the ocean." However, Augustine again draws a line, stating, "It does not follow that the wills of men are to be made subject to the position of the stars." So why should we accept astronomy when it comes to animals and nature and not applied to humans? The answers the authors give is an excellent example of how multifaceted the thinking of these Christian authors was on the subject. Augustine's reasoning is a blistering naturalistic and philosophical critique of astrology that would claim that the stars predicted or controlled the fates of humans. He brings forth several arguments showing the absurdity of this sort of astrology, which still carry weight today. The first is to consider the lives of twins who would both be conceived and born under the same astrological situation, but frequently led very different lives and sometimes are even different sexes. And even if they were similar, it would be impossible to conclude that this was due to the influence of the stars and not having been nourished in the same house, on the same kinds of food, where they would have also the same kinds of air, the same locality, the same quality of water, which, according to the testimony of medical science, have a very great influence, good or bad, on the condition of bodily health, and where they would also be accustomed to the same kinds of exercise, they would have bodily constitutions so similar that they would be similarly affected with sickness at the same time and by the same causes. Later, he describes the response of astrologers to the argument of twins, in which they give an example of a potter's wheel spun very fast. The astrologer would twice, in rapid succession, make 2 marks on its rim, and once the wheel had stopped, noted that the marks would be some distance apart. This was meant to illustrate that even if 2 twins were born very close together, the orientation of the heavens would be notably different. Augustine responded, calling the argument more fragile than the vessels which are fashioned by the rotation of that wheel, noting that if the heavens moved so quickly, it would be impossible to observe the heavens or predict them mathematically with sufficient precision to make any reasonable predictions. Augustine offers additional testimony against astrology in his Confessions, in which he admits his interest in astrology during his youth, but was advised to reject it by his doctor. He later recounts the story of a father of his friend, Firmimus, who he claims put astrology to a practical test by recording the precise position of the heavens so as to gather fresh proofs of astrology when certain events occurred. Firmimus noted that he was born at the same moment as another child, but the other child was born to a servant. And yet Firmimus, born in a high estate in his parents' house, ran his course through the prosperous paths of this world, and was increased in wealth and elevated to honors, whereas that slave, the yoke of his condition being unrelaxed, continued to serve his masters. Other Christian writers offered similar naturalistic critiques, such as Gregory of Nyssa from the 4th century. In his letter, Against Fate, he argued that if fates were individualized based on one's horoscope, how could natural disasters and war eliminate entire cities? Aside from naturalistic reasoning, other Christian authors reject astrology because it rejects the concept of free will. Nemesius of Emesa states, "Those who attribute the cause for all events to the revolution of the stars do not only combat common sense, but they also render useless all state justice. For the laws are out of place, and the courts are unnecessary when they punish those who are responsible for nothing. Praise and blame are irrational, and prayers senseless, since everything occurs according to fate. Providence is also eliminated together with piety, while humankind is found to be a mere instrument of the ration above. For by this not only the parts of the body, but also the thoughts of the soul are stimulated to act. In a word, those who say such things annihilate what is in our power and the nature of the contingent, which is nothing less than to ruin and demean the world." He then takes reasoning further, implying that if the stars make people evil, and God is the creator of the stars, then this makes God the source of evil, stating, "But the stars too are unjust, in cleansing the fornicators and the murderers, and prior to the stars, their creator God mentioned the reason." Basil of Caesarea agrees with this, writing, "For the evil stars throw the blame of their wickedness upon him who made them. If the evil is inherent in their nature, the creator is the author of evil." Another author that we see commenting on this is St. John Chrysostom. In his homilies on Matthew, he tries to balance the biblical claim that Jesus' birth was foretold by a star, an astrological sign, with the orthodox opinion that astrology regarding people was false. He tells us, "For surely this is not the business of astrology, to know from the stars who are born, but from the hour when men are born to predict what shall befall them. So it is said." His conclusion is that, thus, this star was not of the common sort, or rather, not a star at all, as it seems at least to me, but some invisible power transformed into this appearance. He supports this conclusion by noting that the stars rise in the east and set in the west, but the Star of Bethlehem was in a fixed location in the sky. Thus, he concludes that Jesus' birth was not heralded by a true astrological sign, but rather by some other power. Another interesting take on astrology comes from Christian of Stavelot, who tells us that astrology was legitimate. However, the coming of Christ freed us from our fates and made it no longer a valid source of truth. Beginning in the 13th century, we see a revival of astrology with two authors working to defend it against the objections previously discussed. The first was Albertus Magnus, who wrote a defense of astrology entitled Speculum Astronomiae. His argument was that astrology did not negate free will, but perfects it, as he believed that astrology is God's will revealed, and understanding it would allow us to conform to it or reject it based on our will. Thus, astrology was not a divinatory practice, but a prescriptive one. The second was Thomas Aquinas. His work, Summa Theologia, proposed that astrology had some powers over the human body, but only over the lower faculties of the soul, which would incline humans towards actions, but not necessitate them. Perhaps surprisingly, these two authors initially faced little pushback, but at the beginning of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation had the Church feeling the need to reevaluate and clean house of heretical knowledge of all sorts. This effort began when the Inquisition produced its first index of forbidden books in the early 1550s, the Commissario Generale. However, astrology was notably absent from this first list. This is despite the fact that the list did ban other divinatory arts, such as geomancy, hydromancy, and pyromancy. Books of astrology wouldn't make their way onto the list of banned books until 1557, after the previous leader of the Roman Inquisition, Cardinal Gian Pietro Carafa, became pope under the name Paul IV. This index banned all books and writings of chiromancy, geomancy, hydromancy, physiognomy, pyromancy, or necromancy, or that discuss sortilege, sorcery, incantations, magical divinations, or astrological judgments regarding horoscopes, birth, future events, or regarding the particular outcomes, circumstances of the life or death of any man. However, it was unclear at this stage whether the texts of Magnus and Aquinas would fall under this prohibition. Another list of banned books was released on December 30th, 1558. This time, it prohibited divinations from the magic arts or judicial astrology regarding the future contingent events, or the results of events or cases of chance, having accepted all those natural observations which are useful to the arts of navigation, agriculture, or medicine. Here, we can see that the Church is attempting to draw a finer line, explicitly allowing for certain types of astrology. However, there was a widespread condemnation of this index due to its severity in other areas. The next pope, Pius IV, decided that the list needed to be revised entirely. This time, the power was not given to the Inquisition, but to a commission appointed by the Council of Trent. In 1563, the council issued 10 rules concerning the prohibited books. The 9th rule stated, "The bishops shall diligently see to it that the books, treatises, catalogues determining destiny by astrology, which, in the matter of future events, consequences, or fortuitous occurrences, or of actions that depend on the human will, attempt to affirm something as certain to take place, are not read or possessed. Permitted, on the other hand, are the opinions and natural observations which have been written in the interest of navigation, agriculture, or the medical art. Again, this rule allows for some astrology as legitimate, but there is also a key word hidden in this passage. It refers to something as certain to take place. This suggests that the council may have had some sympathy towards the arguments of Magnus and Aquinas that astrology may suggest something, but does not demand it. This remained the rule until 1586, in which Pope Sixtus V issued a papal bull referred to as Coeli et Terrae. This bull was largely meant to provide clarity on various forms of divination. While its opening was sympathetic to and echoed Aquinas' thoughts, it also lamented that superstitious thought continued to flourish, and thus again tightened the reins, again outlawing any sort of astrology that had a whiff of being able to determine future events, even if they claim or assert that they do not affirm it to be certain. However, predictions relating to agriculture, navigation, and medicine were still accepted. With this proclamation from the Pope, this would remain the last significant change to the Church's positions on the matter of astrology in the period that we are discussing. Many of the people that we've hitherto discussed had some understanding and thus provided commentaries on astronomy. However, I'd be remiss not to mention a few instances in which we find members of the Church engaging in astronomy and its transmission without providing much in the way of commentary. In my video on a brief history of astronomy before the telescope, I spoke some about the Carolingian Renaissance, in which there was a brief flare-up of interest in astronomy. However, one thing I did not mention was that the earliest description of an astrolabe in Latin also appears in this period. This text was translated from an Arabic text at the Abbey of Santa Maria de Ripoll by Lobet, the Archdeacon of Barcelona, sometime around the year 975. Unsurprisingly, we find the first astrolabe with Latin text appearing around the same time. Then, in 1393, the Benedictine monk John Westwick published a book describing an astronomical instrument similar to an astronomical quadrant. The excitement of astronomy was so pervasive that it even reached a young man by the name of Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II. Gerbert was born in France and spent his early years in a monastery, but due to his insatiable curiosity, which could not be satiated by the books in his home monastery, he was transferred to one in Cordoba in Spain, as it was close to the famed library of Cordoba, which is said to have had between 40,000 and 400,000 books by the year 976. There, Gerbert learned astronomy from Islamic and Jewish scholars, and learned to create many astronomical instruments, including the astrolabe in our Miller sphere and the star globe. He and his dear friend Aldebaro, the Archbishop of Reims, would found a proto-university which taught the classical trivium and quadrivium, the latter of which included astronomy. Astronomy seemed to be catching on. Even Gerbert's rival, Abbo of Fleury, wrote basic astronomical texts. Gerbert's education made him a highly desired teacher, especially for kings and emperors. When Gerbert traveled to Rome in 970, he was invited to stay and teach because, as Ricker St. Remy noted, Musica and Astronomia, two of the four subjects in the quadrivium, were completely ignored in Italy at the time. However, Gerbert's learning helped him to soar too high, and he found himself enmeshed in politics, leading to him becoming Pope Sylvester II. This meant he no longer had time to dedicate to his astronomical and other scientific pursuits. And ultimately, upon his death, astronomy would be used to tarnish his legacy, as his rivals would claim that his astronomical tools were used to summon and control demons. In this video, we've taken a broad look at Christian views on astronomy. In some cases, as with calendrical astronomy and lunisolar astronomy, tension was non-existent, and an astronomical education was even encouraged. With other forms, such as planetary astronomy, the field was largely overlooked. Only with respect to philosophical astronomy and astrology do we see any significant tension. Even then, it was often short-lived, and there is little evidence that the pronouncements against it were strictly enforced. But by and large, Christians held no particularly strong feelings towards astronomy. Perhaps Basil of Caesarea sums it up the best. Those who have written about the nature of the universe have discussed at length the shape of the earth. If the earth be spherical or cylindrical, if it resembles a disk and is equally rounded in all parts, or if it has the fourth of a winnowing basket and is hollow in the middle. All these conjectures have been made by the cosmographers, each one upsetting that of his predecessor. It will not lead me to give less importance to the creation of the universe that the servant of God, Moses, is silent as to the shapes. He has not said that the earth is 180,000 furlongs in circumference. He has not measured into what extent of air its shadow projects itself while the sun revolves around it, nor stated how this shadow, casting itself upon the moon, produces eclipses. He has passed over in silence as useless. All that is unimportant for us. In short, the scriptures are not meant to lift eyes to the stars, only souls to heaven.